Good morning and a very warm welcome to this EPC update. I am just waiting a few seconds to let a few more people enter the room and then we will get underway. So good morning and welcome to a rather special edition of EPC Update, because it is now the 50th time we have gathered together. Those of you who've been with us since the start may remember that Update was launched right at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic as a way of keeping track of developments. We started focusing very much on COVID and since then have broadened our horizons. So it is great to be with you here on this 50th anniversary, and thank you for joining us. With me, as always, Fabian Zuleeg, Chief Executive and Chief Economist of the EPC, and Janis, Emmanouilidis, Deputy Chief Executive and Director of Studies. And we are delighted to welcome our special guest, and they don't come much more special than that, the EPC's new president, Brigid Laffan, who is also Emeritus Professor at the European University Institute. And today we want to take a slightly longer perspective, look back over the last 3 years at the developments we have seen, the multiple crises the EU has been through, assess the EU's response, but also look forward to what does all this mean for the future. As always, a totally interactive discussion. If you want to ask a question when I open up to the floor, please click on the raised hands button if you would like to speak. And if you prefer to write your question, put it in the Q&A box. And please be as brief as possible so I can see at a glance what your question is and who it is for. So let us get underway. And Brigid, a very warm welcome, both as president of the EPC and to this update. You came on before in your former capacity. It's great to have you back for this anniversary event. Let me start really with a sort of helicopter view of where we are now after the seismic events of the last 3 years. I mentioned we launched during the COVID pandemic. We have, of course, the ultimate seismic event in the shape of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Brexit negotiations seem to have been a permanent backdrop until very recently of EPC updates. What's your assessment of where we are now in terms of how the EU has responded?
I think when we ask questions like how the EU has responded, we should think a little about the benchmark that we're using. So are we looking at how the EU has responded to these recent crises vis-a-vis previous crises, or vis-a-vis other major actors, or the challenges? And I think there are different answers depending. So on the first, vis-a-vis previous crises, I think the EU has responded much more effectively to the crises post-16, post the refugee crisis, than it did to the Eurozone crisis and the refugee crisis. But of course, in terms of the challenges, I think COVID, despite the fact that the EU started in a very fragmented way and it was everyone for each other, and there was all that great expectation that the EU could really have gone very badly wrong. We had, in the end, an effective response, and in two important ways. One, the decision on the RRF, which I regard as a major learning from the Eurozone crisis, that there had to be a response to the economic impact. And then I think the other, and there will be important learnings from this, was the joint procurement of vaccines. And that was particularly important for smaller states, and most EU states are small, because there could have been a competition with the big pharma companies for vaccines. So in that sense, then the response has been very good. But in response to the world we live in now, I think on the face of it, the first year response to Ukraine, yes, the toolkit has been developed, and yes, there has been a more robust response than one might have anticipated. But if one thinks about the world we live in, the acceleration of change, the hardening of geopolitics, the weaponization of interdependence, if we think about the world that Europe now confronts, then I think there are extraordinary challenges, of course, not just for Europe, but for the world, but particularly for Europe, given the the nature of the EU. And I would say we can't forget, obviously, the dual transformations of digital and climate. It's not, even though Ukraine takes the headlines, then those are also big, big challenges facing our world.
Thank you. And if I could just follow up before I come to Fabian and Janis, you have written about and talked about a concept that you call collective power Europe. What do you mean by that? And in the context of what you just said, is this a concept that is really beginning to develop in the EU? Is it changing the way the EU sees itself and the world sees the EU?
So Collective Power Europe, I'm interested in what I consider to be a step change in the EU post-Brexit. Not just incremental, but a step change. And then I began to think about how I would frame that change. And when I used the concept Collective Power Europe, firstly, the emphasis on power, that the EU is now a very self-consciously a power, but that it's not a command power in the sense of traditional power, of coercive power, but rather the power to get things done. And then one has to ask, how does the EU amass capacity to get things done? And for me, critical elements are there has to be a reasonably high level of consensus on what the problems are. Without this, if you don't know what the problems are, you don't know what solutions you should look for. But then also that amassing of institutional capacity and how the different elements of the EU governance system work together. And I think when faced with a crisis, they tend to be more collaborative than competitive, although the turf wars never quite disappear, as we know, but even in Washington, the turf wars never quite disappear. And then the third element of this collective power is the toolkit, how the EU uses its existing policy toolkit and new instruments. But I think in order for the EU to respond to the world we're now in, it requires a second step change in collective capacity. And that's, I think, where we're at.
Let's come back to that in a little while. Fabian, your overall assessment of where we are, and Brigid talking then about the power to get things done. I mean, it is fair to say, and we'll come back to some of the maybe the shortcomings of the response, or I want to talk about whether, we've talked about this before, whether the EU is waking up to the momentousness of where we are now. But your assessment of the last 3 years and whether it has demonstrated that power in the end to get things done.
Well, I very much broadly agree with Brigid. I think we've seen unprecedented changes in what the European Union has done and how it has done it. Very often we were faced with situations where people said it cannot be done, and then it still happened. We were also faced with situations where people said this is the end of the Union, this is going to be the end of European cooperation. And those very negative assessments have not been true. But I think when we're looking at what we are doing, and I would say that also applies to some of the previous crises, what we're doing about the fundamental crisis we're facing now, what is often lacking is a systemic, a structural response to the challenges we're facing. We are reacting to the challenges which are there. We are addressing the immediate issues which are there. But very often, the moment that immediate crisis then is over, there's very little action. And we've seen that in a number of the crises also prior to the last 3 years. And I think when you're looking at that in relation to the challenges we are facing now, then it's something which I would call a progress illusion. We are moving forward and we're doing some of the right things, but they are not enough to address the exponential nature of the challenge we are facing. So we're basically having linear responses to exponential challenges. And that cannot go well for an indefinite period. I think we will hit a point where we will have to make a decision whether we do significantly more, significantly differently, And if we don't do that, and I think this is an important point to emphasize, there's no predetermined outcome here. It might well be that we don't rise to this challenge, but if we don't do this, we will have lost the ability to shape the future. We will have lost the ability to determine European interests and values.
Again, if I could just follow up before I come to Janis, there are those who would say, look, given the scale of the challenge and the urgency of the challenge, we are still in the midst of that war, that progress is progress, however you define it, and that maybe this is not the moment. I want to come back later to the whole issue of EU reform, which we haven't talked about very much since the end of the Conference on the Future of Europe and so on. But really, the EU has no choice, Fabian, many would argue, but to be reactive, and the strategy will have to come later. What would you say to that?
I think that for me is a misreading of the situation, because those responses which I'm talking about are indirect response to the challenge we are facing. There are only different types of responses. We're talking about addressing some of the systemic underlying issues, which will continue to come back. So just to give one example to make it more concrete, one of the issues we have seen, I think, very clearly within the current crisis is the challenge which comes from the internal deterioration of rule of law, that we have countries now which are no longer willing to cooperate within the European system, and which will use issues such as unanimity, the veto, to blackmail the rest of the Union. Now that is something which has to be addressed, but we're not willing at the moment to talk about what are the reforms in decision-making, what are the reforms in the processes which would be needed to address those kind of issues. So it's not that the kind of things I'm talking about have nothing to do with the current crisis, rather the opposite, but they go more towards the longer-term strategic thinking. And this is something which we've seen, I think, throughout the whole permacrisis, as we've called it, that there's a lack of strategic forward-looking thinking, that we're not actually coming together as a union to determine what are the long-term outcomes we are aiming for. And I suspect one of the reasons for that is because we don't actually agree on those outcomes.
Well, and Janis, if I could pick up that point with you, first of all, your overall assessment of where we are and the response, and whether you share Brigid and Fabian's analysis, but also when we talk about what Fabian called the progress illusion, one of the reasons the response, he says, is linear rather than the structural exponential, meeting those exponential challenges, is keeping that unity, is avoiding disunity. So both your assessment, but your sense of whether where we are is inevitable, and the only way to keep the club together is to do it this way, rather than to take on that structural challenge right at this moment.
Well, thanks, Jacki. I agree with a lot what has been said, but taking the opportunity of the fact that this is the 50th edition of our update, and looking back since 2020 and looking at the two major challenges which we have been facing, meaning COVID and now the war in Ukraine, I'm more worried now than I was or have been during the COVID period. I think if you, in retrospect, look back at the reaction to COVID-19 in the health sector, it originally took us long, and we struggled at all levels, by the way, at the national and at the European, to come up with a joint response. But eventually, I think we were very successful. The common procurement of vaccine, which Brigid already mentioned, Next Generation EU, which even a couple of weeks before the final decision taken, people were not convinced, and I'm talking about people at the highest level, were not convinced that an agreement could be reached. But there was an agreement reached, and it was of a fundamental nature. So when I look into the COVID-19 crisis, I think despite all the problems, we did rather well. With respect to Ukraine and to the watershed, to the Zeitenwende, call it whatever you may, I think it's a mixed bag. Yes, on the one hand, when it comes to the concrete challenges which we're facing, we have individually and collectively reacted rather well. The argument of being faster, more united, more decisive, I think is a right evaluation of things. But I think we have a lack of understanding of what actually the fundamental potential consequences of this crisis is. Brigid was saying that you need to have a consensus on what the problem is if you want to start addressing it. And I think we do not have a consensus on the overall consequences of this crisis. And we are arguing, and there are reasons to do so, that we need to uphold now unity. But that means that on some of the differences, which there are, and there are marked differences, we don't even have a strategic dialogue. Also at the top level, with respect to what actually are the consequences. And if we do not have this kind of a dialogue, and we don't have it also for the sake of keeping up unity, because we know that there are immense differences among the EU 27, that if we do not have that amount of discussion, if we do not confront what actually is the analysis of the situation, we will not be addressing collectively what needs to be done. And that's not something which, by the way, has longer term consequences, which obviously will have, especially if there's a deterioration of certain situations also at the geopolitical level, but not only in future, but it also has consequences today. So this appreciation of many saying, we now need to concentrate on the immediate things, we need to uphold unity, we need to be able to take decisions, and then we will address other things once they come at a later point in time, and not now, because that might undermine our unity, is not only the wrong approach from a long-term perspective, but it's also having a negative effect on today's situation, on the amount of the ability to react to the day-to-day consequences which we're now facing, because we are not having trust in each other. And I think there is a distrust issue among the EU 27.
And what lies behind that, Janis, just to follow up, why such a level of distrust?
Well, first of all, we disagree on major issues. Look, for example, at the question of our future relationship with China. There are immense differences among EU member states, but also within member states, by the way. When it comes to our future relationship with Russia, there are different appreciations. When it comes to the question of enlargement, there are different appreciations and views in terms of how much of a strategic imperative enlargement is. And I could go on. So on substantial questions, there are severe differences among the 27. And that, I think, is actually hampering our ability to move forward and also to have the level of ambition which we actually now need, taking the gravity of the moment, the gravity of this crisis, and the longer term effects of the crisis on trends, which, by the way, already were existing before the invasion of Ukraine. This crisis is acting like an accelerator in many ways on things which we had started before. But collectively, I think we're not responding adequately to the challenge. And I must say that it's not getting better. I actually have the impression that we're moving in the wrong direction. Also because in the headlines, the war in Ukraine is not any longer where it was some months ago. So the pressure you need at the European level, not only to come up with joint responses, but also to have a frank debate with each other, which is important with respect to increasing the trust among the EU 27, is actually not happening.
Thank you very much. And I'm just wondering, though, I mean, when you talk, because you said, and you've all echoed, did rather well during COVID, perhaps precisely because it didn't raise issues that divided member states in quite the same way. But Brigid, reaction to what Fabian was talking about, the progress illusion, do you think there is a risk there? And you talked about the major learnings from Brexit, the major learnings from COVID. And then you said, we now need that second step change. What are those learnings and how do we apply them to this second step change?
So firstly, the first big learning from the Eurozone crisis is time matters. That crisis could have been brought under control much more quickly and much more cheaply. And it took a very long time at an extraordinary social and economic cost to the debtor states. And I think that the RRF was a response to that memory of how badly the EU did during the Eurozone crisis. I think so time matters, urgency matters. The second is that you need the institutions, both at the European level, but also then down into the member states, to work together. You can't go against the member states. The EU will always go with the grain of the national. So you've got to try to bring the national into the European, and out of that forge a reasonable level of consensus. I'm not asking for unanimity on everything, but rather that the differences can be managed in a way that aren't detrimental. As Janis said, Janis's view now is that those differences are detrimental. My view is that we're still in the midst of a struggle, and it's a struggle in the EU to come to terms with a very different geopolitics and geoeconomics. Economic security, for example, has ratcheted up the hierarchy of issues. And Fabian rightly called the progress illusion, but I think the one thing Ukraine has done is it's shattered many illusions. It's shattered the illusion that interstate war is not possible in Europe. It's shattered the illusion that Europe is not very dependent on the US for security and defense. So it has shattered many illusions, and those illusions have now got to be confronted, or the consequences of the shattering has now got to be confronted. And for me, the issue is, how can the EU regain agency in all of this? Because these are very big issues, and the EU is attempting to regain agency at a time when, for example, the United States has its Inflation Reduction Act, ERA, big subsidies. China is clearly emerging from COVID and is under Xi Jinping, is, as von der Leyen said, more repressive at home and more aggressive abroad. That's the China we now live with. And of course, there then is the China-Russia link, which has major implications for the war in Ukraine. On the war in Ukraine, I think we're at a very poised at a very delicate moment, because there will be, on what time frame, I don't know, the Ukrainians will attempt an offensive. The success, in my view, of that offensive is really important, because the question is, can it break the impasse, or are we facing a long and frozen war? And if we're facing a long and frozen war in Ukraine, then I think it will drop off the news. In other words, Europe will accommodate itself, but we have to remind ourselves that on our own continent, there are unspeakable crimes being committed, war crimes being committed, and absolute obligation, because it won't stop with Ukraine if Russia wins this war. So again, urgency and agency would be the two words I would use.
Thank you very much indeed. Let us turn to, you talked about that completely changed geopolitical environment we're in. And Janis, just in terms of, do you believe that the war in Ukraine has changed both the perception of the EU as a global actor, but also the reality, in the sense that, many surprised by the degree to which unity has held. The EU has responded, and has responded collectively to developments. But is that a function of reacting to in a pressing way? Do you think that lack of the strategic thinking is affecting its role as a geopolitical actor? And in terms of those divisions, you mentioned China already, I think Brigid did as well, and we saw that played out with Emmanuel Macron, what happened after he went to Beijing. We saw Ursula von der Leyen's speech to the EPC that captured headlines, setting a different tone. So how do you see broadly the impact of all of this on the EU's role as a geopolitical actor, but also the relationship with key players, China and the US? Same question to you all. I'll start with Janis this time.
Well, first of all, I think one cannot underestimate the geopolitical, by the way, also the geo-economic impact and consequences of the war in Ukraine. I think that for me is a starting point. And if you don't start from that appreciation, reading of things, of how grave, how significant the consequences are, I think if you don't have that in your mind, the response you will also give to it, whether you are the EU, whether you are a member state of the EU, whether you are other actor at the global level, will depend on that. And Now, in terms of the appreciation of the EU being a strategic actor, I think, and that's how I understood partially Brigid, the verdict is still out. We're in the midst of an evolving situation. However, my assessment is that we're not moving in the right direction, as I said. And there's so many things on which you need to work on if your assessment is that there are grave consequences of this war, that you need to have what I would call strategic persistence. So not only do you have to understand what actually the situation looks like, react to the immediate concerns, but then also put things on a track and continue to work in the direction of being able to confront the potential consequences of the crisis. And by the way, we all know that if you prepare for a future situation, you can also avert some negative consequences. And it's not only about the strategic deterrence, it's also about your ability to be persuasive at the international level in political terms, and not only in military and defense terms. But that requires a level of strategic persistence, which I don't see. And if you take up, and I agree with what you said, Brigid, that probably what we're having and what we will be confronted with is a long conflict with a lot of ups and downs, with extensive uncertainty. And if you look at it from the perspective of one of the major actors of this war, of Vladimir Putin, and those who are supporting it, then this is probably in their interest. They want this to drag on for a long time. They want to be able to escalate the situation whenever they feel that they want to escalate it, because one, this keeps them on the geopolitical radar, that keeps them and him important at the global level, but it also secures that he and those supporting him will be able to stay in power in Russia itself. So probably this scenario is the most likely scenario. And if we don't understand that we do not have the luxury to wait and see how things will develop, but actually start preparing ourselves for this kind of a scenario and stick to the strategic priorities which we're setting, that's where strategic persistence comes in, I think we will have a problem.
You talk about preparedness, just to bring in Joe Linen from our audience saying, asking how much would a collective exercise of foresight help to be less reactive and more prepared for proactive engagement? So very much feeding into that. Fabian, your assessment of the perception and reality of the EU's role, but also if you could say 2 words about I think it was Janis who talked earlier about the relationship with China and the problem being that we don't agree. And he put that down. He said that's one of the elements of why distrust is building. We've seen that disagreement played out, how much you interpret and what emphasis you put on what Emmanuel Macron said and how different that was or was not from a sort of underlying speech and so on. But how do you see that discussion evolving?
I think the first starting point for this really has to be looking at the global environment and seeing how much it is changing and how challenging that is going to be for the European Union. We have a tendency to look very much inside, to do navel gazing rather than looking at what is happening out there. And what is happening in the world at the moment is rather frightening. We have intense superpower rivalry. We have my country first. We have the demise of international institutions. There's lots of things which are happening, which will mean that the assumption we had in the European Union, in liberal democracy, that broadly speaking, the world is a benign place for us, that there's something like positive economic interdependence, which will help to lift all the boats over the long period. That illusion should be over by now. And that means we have to act in a very different way, but acting together. And that's where I would say to Joe, foresight is a starting point. But foresight is only asking the what if questions, but you have to also provide the answers. You have to say, what are you going to do if these things are happening? And there we have exactly the kind of divisions Janis was talking about. We don't agree on many of these issues. And to be a strategic actor in this much more contested landscape, you have to be able to speak with one voice. That doesn't mean you agree on every detail, but you have to have a general strategic direction, which is aiming to do the same thing. So if we haven't decided that, and if we are also not willing to bear the cost, and this is something we've already seen. For example, if we look at one of the issues which has already been mentioned, enlargement, we're not willing to do what is necessary if we see enlargement in this new geopolitical, geostrategic context. We're not even able to deal with the Western Balkans, which should be small enough for us to deal with easily within this context. So I think I'm rather, with Janis here, I'm rather negative about the ability of the Union to make that step change, because at the moment, we're not willing to accept the consequences of that. And the consequences of that is that we would have to be much more decisive, much more collective when it comes to these issues, that we would have to be able to also deal with issues such as decision making. I'm not saying having qualified majority voting is the panacea for all the problems we have, but we have to start talking about these kind of reforms. We have to talk about what kind of instruments do we need to act collectively. But what we still see is that member states, and in particular the big member states, who are the ones when it comes to geopolitics, are the ones which matter, are still essentially saying, yes, we should cooperate, but only if we exactly do what we do at home. So there's no willingness at the moment to create something new, something which actually is effective at the European level.
But also, whatever instruments, Brigid, we have, and we'll come to that question of EU reform. If there are divisions about the relationship with China and what the approach should be, if there are divisions about the degree to which we should be following the US or be very independent of the US, and between the US and China in this increasing geopolitical rivalry, relations with Russia, those differences need to be resolved. Whatever instruments you have aren't going to work. Do you see a way forward to come to a consensus on, and in the meantime, what do we do? Do we say the Emmanuel Macrons of this world shouldn't be going to Beijing and giving their opinion on how we should approach it, and Ursula von der Leyen shouldn't be giving speeches with a different tone? How do we deal with this?
So firstly, I think we have to accept that it is entirely predictable that on those big major issues that there will be divergence, because countries come with different traditions, different historical trajectories, and different interests. So I don't think difference is necessarily a problem, provided that the differences can be contained, and as both Janis and Fabian said, that out of this soup that you get a strategic direction. Now, I think European leaders need to be less self-indulgent. It was Macron did not have to mouth off about Taiwan, and I find it extraordinary that he said, you know, Europe shouldn't be interested in Taiwan when we're looking at the rest of the world to help us on Ukraine. So I think that self-indulgence is a real problem. That sense of, you know, that there are cost-free sound bites. There aren't. But moving on to the sort of the strategic direction on China, I think the von der Leyen speech to the EPC was a very fine, crafted speech in terms of setting a broad framework, because she acknowledged the strengths of China, she acknowledged but she also then acknowledged the problems. Her sober, I think the word sober was a very fine word in that speech. And then she said, and I think this is where Europe needs to position itself, is de-risk, not decouple. Because I think the idea that Europe can decouple from China, as in basically reshore everything, that's simply not going to happen, and would come at a very high cost and would be extremely inefficient. But that said, Europe can't think that trade with China is free and open. So Europe has to toughen, and it is using its trade defense mechanisms more effectively now than it did in the past. But so I do think I see where the China policy might land, and I think the balance will be somewhere between cooperation and the systemic rivalry, and it's where it lies there. Then the second element, really important element, is how will the EU relate to the US in terms of transatlantic relations, but also in terms of US relations with China and where it positions itself. And I think that's a much trickier relationship in the sense that there is real dependency in security and defense. But I do think that there is an onus on Europe, particularly in defense, to begin to tackle head on the inefficiencies that are in European security and defense policy, because it's not that Europe doesn't spend a lot of money on defense, it just spends it very badly with weak interoperability, etc., etc. And it should set itself the goal, at least in this phase, of a strengthening of the European pillar of NATO. And the EU should be a security actor that does everything that strengthens that, and to work on industrial policy and to work on procurement and all of those things. But it is going to be difficult for Europe to get that margin, the margin of maneuver, the agency, vis-a-vis these two critical relationships. But then, of course, we also see a banding of the autocracies: China, Iran, Russia. So what does Europe do as a group, a union of democratic states, vis-a-vis the rising of autocracy in our world? And I think what the big question then is, what are the likely developments in globalization? I think we've ended the period of hyper-globalization. Are we now going to see more fragmented globalization, more regional? Will the regional interconnections grow? Will geopolitical proximity be more important than geographical proximity? These are all the big questions. But there's no doubt that when Borrell said Europe has a choice to be a player or a plaything, that captures something really important in terms of the challenge facing Europe. And of course, dealing with the international system, the world outside, is a very tough ask for the EU.
Thank you very much. Questions coming in about EU reform. We'll come back on that. Questions also about leadership, which I want to come back on later in the context of the Euro elections next year. But Janis, you wanted to react to something that Brigid had said there, but also if we can bring into this equation the question of enlargement, because major concerns now, particularly in Ukraine, that the momentum that we had last year seems to have gone. The row at the moment over the grain embargoes imposed by Poland, Hungary and Slovakia, showing that when you come up against reality, things are a little different. And how do you see the state of play in the debate over enlargement? Is there a real appetite for it? Or was this something that was done in response to the war, but there wasn't, if you like, people thought, well, yes, we can say you have a membership perspective, we can give you candidate status, but this is a long way off, so we don't need to deal with this now, whereas the Ukrainians are saying, you do, this really matters as part of your response. How do you see that? But please do, I think you wanted to react to something Brigid had said first.
Yes, I wanted to react to a word which has been used now a couple of times from all of us, which is leadership. I know that you want to come back to that, but just let me share two reflections before I say something on enlargement. One is, yes, there are divergences among the EU 27, by the way, also within individual member states, and that's fine. And by the way, one of the main characteristics of pluralist democracies is that we're allowed to have differences. So this is extremely part of our DNA and is perfectly fine. The problem is that we're not putting the divergences on the table. We're not actually discussing them. And Paul Taylor, in a comment, in a question addressing to us, was saying we need to force EU leaders in a room and force them to trash out their interests. And by the way, also their differences. This is not happening. And if you talk to people from within the European Council or for people who are close to the European Council, they will tell you we do not have this kind of a strategic dialogue. We're avoiding it. We're consciously avoiding it. And also referring to Ursula von der Leyen's speech at the EPC, which I think was a very good speech, there were a lot who reacted of, why, you're going too far. you should not interfere. This is not your role. You have a role to play, but not this kind of a role in terms of positioning yourself, positioning also the commission the way she did. And that has to do with the lack of willingness, not only the lack of readiness, the lack of willingness to have a strategic dialogue. And the second leadership aspect is, and also we made comparisons to previous crises. And there are, if you make the comparison to the COVID-19 challenge, there was definitely at some point, and that was rather early on, 2020, if you remember, made the agreement between the Germans and the French, which then led to Next Generation EU, where leadership was there and was pushing. Now we don't have that. We have a leadership deficit collectively at the individual level. Look into France, look into Germany. There's a key question with respect to Poland and the elections in the autumn. But what I'm seeing is not only that there is a lack of readiness to invest political capital, but there's not only navel gazing, but there's an increasing what I would call marginalization of the EU. The EU is not at the center stage of discussions in the member states when it comes to the current challenges.
Okay. I'm going to ask you to hold for a moment on the enlargement point, because Fabian wanted to react, but briefly, if you could, Fabian, because I want to talk about the economy and I want to come back to this issue of reform. But just in reference to the leadership question, just to throw into the mix, one of our audience asking, can you elaborate on the responsibility of individual leaderships and the internal crisis governance of the different EU institutions? So we've been talking about EU leaders in the member states, but here also asking about the leaders of the EU institutions. But Fabian.
I think this is a point which really runs through a lot of the comments, because what we are actually seeing in a number of different areas is that people are talking about Zeitenwende. They're saying things have changed, but what they are actually doing is old reactions to the new challenges we are facing. It is exactly the same kind of reaction we've seen in the past. So when it comes to enlargement, when it comes to all of these fundamental challenges where the situation has changed in ways which cannot be turned back. We cannot go back to a world before the Zeitenwende, but nevertheless, you hear exactly the same kind of responses as we had before. So when you look at enlargement, for example, we have one faction which essentially is saying, well, we'll see, maybe in a very long time, maybe after we have seen that Ukraine has reformed, and secretly, a number of them are wishing it will never happen because they think the challenges are too big. And then you have another faction which is saying tomorrow, it has to happen immediately. Both of those are completely unrealistic. And we know that the answer has to be somewhere in between that. But we don't have the discussion to actually say, what does a realistic plan look like? What would be the milestones to get there? What would be the political commitment? So we're having old debates around new challenges, and that cannot work.
Thank you. Janis, 2 words on enlargement. And interesting, the Commission's report on Ukraine and Moldova and their membership was due soon. It's been pushed back to the end of May. Precisely, I think those sort of reports are supposed to set those milestones, set that process. How do you see that? Question briefly from you and from Brigid on enlargement, and then I would like to move on, and I will come back on these questions about fundamental reform, and there's a question also from John Palmer about reviewing where we are. But Janis, on enlargement.
First of all, you also addressed another question to Fabian, which related to something which someone in the audience said, which is leadership at the EU institutional level. And here we also have an issue. And I do not want to discuss as to whether the president of the Commission or the president of the European Council are doing a good or a bad job, and one can have differences of opinion about this. But what we clearly have, and I think this is a problem in the context of the lack of having a strategic discussion, is that both sides of Rue de la Loi are not cooperating with each other. We have a problem between the two institutions, the Commission and the European Council, and their leadership, because their leadership is having a problem with each other, which, by the way, is not a personal issue, which we now need to address from a personal perspective. It's a structural issue. It's something we need to think of if we think of what we have to do in 2024. So let's have that also in mind. Now, with respect to enlargement, I concur with what Fabian was saying. We're talking about enlargement, but we're having huge disagreements. And by the way, we have unholy alliances. who for different reasons, when it comes to enlargement, are pushing, I think, in the wrong direction. Because from my standpoint, enlargement has again become a strategic imperative. Now, I'm not saying that massive rounds of enlargement, including also Ukraine, will actually take place, because this is something that will depend on a lot of factors. Factors related to us as the 27, but also factors related to those who want to join the club. But what I see as a strategic myopia is that we are actually not trying to prepare ourselves for future rounds of enlargement, whenever and if they will take place, because that undermines then our credibility. It undermines our credibility vis-a-vis those who want to join the club, but it also undermines, by the way, our internal credibility in terms of what we're promising and actually delivering.
So you would link that back to the issue of fundamental EU reform, the sort of issues that came out of the conference on the future of Europe.
I think you want to discuss about that later in detail.
I do, but that you would link those two issues very closely.
Well, obviously there's a link between the accession of new members to the EU and their level of preparedness and what needs to be done in the context of that process, and the absorption capacity, to use the technical term, of the EU, its ability to actually be able to welcome new members.
Okay.
And in this case, given that we're also talking about Ukraine, we're talking also not only of smaller countries joining, but of a country of 40 million. And if you look into the discussion we're now having, which relates to common agricultural policy, this shows how difficult this process is. But by the way, even when you prepare yourself for future rounds of enlargement, we think as if we have to do this at one moment in time. It might take phases for us to get there.
Okay. Brigid, on this question, would you agree with Janis? He says enlargement has become a strategic imperative, and the EU is making a big mistake if it doesn't at least prepare itself.
I fully agree. Not only do I think it's a strategic imperative, I think it will happen. On what timescale and with what countries, I'm less sure about. But there will be new member states of the EU. And enlargement is not something that happens to the EU. It is intrinsic to the dynamic of integration, historically. Now, we're running close to coming to the end of where the boundaries of the EU might lie, but the EU could still become a union of 35, 36 states. So that the existing union can't absorb this without addressing all of the fundamental issues of decision making, etc., etc. But I do think we may see in the next phase of enlargement also slightly different approaches, in that it won't become a ladder and you finally accept all of the acquis. It could become more a block-like, you get access to some parts and then, but none of this is clear and none of it has been debated. But I would, and I don't bet, but if I did bet, I would put a bet that there will be new member states of the EU. But we must also remember that all aspiring member states always want to join before they're ready. The EU always wants to delay it as long as it can. And what's important is that countries don't join before they're ready enough, because the EU, being a member state of the EU is a tough business, and you shouldn't join just to think it will solve all your domestic problems. All EU membership is an opportunity, multiple opportunities, but unless states use the opportunities, then membership is neither here nor there, and it becomes a problem both for the country and for the EU. There are very delicate issues around timing, process, and the nature of enlargement itself. And I think are we even at base camp when it comes to a discussion of the next enlargement? I suspect we're very bottom of the, there's a big, the Himalayas are there and we're very much at the base camp.
Thank you very much. We need to move on, and I will come back on those questions from our audience on reform in a moment. But Fabian, just turning to the other side of this equation, and we talked about, Brigid talked about the RFF, the Recovery and Resilience Facility, at the time of the COVID pandemic, and that unprecedented decision, both on the size of the financial package, that 1.8 trillion euro, but also on the way it was funded, that agreement on common borrowing. Two questions really to you. Fabian, is the EU doing enough now to respond to the economic impact of all these events that we have seen? And if it's not, is it taking that long-term, I think you've already implied it isn't taking that long-term strategic vision that we need? What does it need to do, if not, instead of this sort of reactive response? And do you ever see another, I mean, have we created a precedent that could become part of that response to say, in the future, these are tools, these are mechanisms that we will have recourse to more readily? Or was that really a one-off? Big question, several questions in one. Apologies, time is short.
Well, firstly, I think just looking back at the RRF, I think it's important to emphasize that, yes, it was a very important break with the past. It was doing something unprecedented. I wouldn't quite say a Hamiltonian moment, but it was an important moment. And just as a little side note, because I can't resist it, it wouldn't have happened if the UK still would have been a member state. I think that's an important thing to also bear in mind, that some things became possible, which wouldn't have been possible before. But we also have to see that it was a very specific instrument, which was dealing with a situation where it wasn't about blame between member states. It was an external, it was a health threat, which had an impact on everybody. It was much easier to get through. It had leadership from France, from Germany, coming together and pushing this through against some resistance internally. So there were a lot of specific conditions which made that possible. And even within all that, we've actually not really used it. The money hasn't been drawn down. We have still struggled to spend the money, despite the fact that putting that in place has been very important. Now, I'm saying all that because this is coming back to what I was talking about in terms of progress illusion. The challenges we are now facing are much bigger because they are not just economic in nature, they're interconnected. We cannot talk about just an economic situation. We have to talk about inflation. We have to talk about cost of living, cost of doing business. We have to talk about what will happen during the next winter in terms of energy, in terms of prices, in terms of what that will do to different parts of the European economy. We have to talk about technology. We have to talk about industrial policy. And we have to see all of this together and not as separate issues which we can put into silos, which we can deal with one by one, because that's not going to work. So what we actually need now, and this is the theme which is running through this, we need to have a strategic discussion about what do we want our economy to look like? How do we make sure that the trade-offs, the difficult choices which are there, are being made? Because if we don't do this, and I think we are already starting to see that, one of the issues which is at risk is the fundamental transformation which we have to put our economy through. Climate change, sustainability, it is an issue, as Brigid has said, we have to address. I mean, this is not an option. It is something which is of existential importance to address. But if we're not having a plan, if we're not having also the scale of response which is necessary, then we are going to fail. And at the moment, despite all the good things which we have been doing, despite all the targets we have, we're actually moving in the wrong direction. And just a final word on that, I am rather worried that before this winter, people were talking about that it wouldn't be this winter which would be the most difficult. It would be next winter. Nobody seems to be talking about this anymore. And I'm rather worried that we get to autumn, we get to winter without the preparation, without the discussion with the populations about what will happen and how that might impact. Maybe we'll be lucky. Maybe we'll have a very mild winter. Maybe we will not have this negative impact. But we should have learned from previous crises that it's better to prepare, better to be over-prepared than to end up in a situation which we can't manage.
Thank you. Brief reactions on that, Brigid, Janis, if you would, and then we'll come back to EU reform and the European elections as well before we finish. Brigid.
Firstly, on the political economy, Europe avoided narrowly a recession last year. That's a good thing. But just because it avoided it time one doesn't mean it will avoid it again. So there's the immediate macroeconomic circumstance with inflation, energy costs, etc., etc. But Fabian was absolutely right to give top billing to the structural issues. And if Europe has its Fit for 55 and the transformation on the climate side, and that is connected to that other transformation, digitalization. And here, Europe, we're not a continent that's tech savvy. The US seems to, even its society absorbs new technology very easily. China clearly does as well, and we're less good, I think, on absorbing major technological change and moving from a strong research base to products in the market. So I think those deep structural issues are there and long-term have to be addressed. And of course, all that's the other issue there is demography. We're also an aging continent.
Thank you. Janis.
There's nothing to contradict, obviously, but let me share two thoughts. And one is a word which Fabian mentioned, and I think this is an issue we need to have a close look, whether it has to do with the economy, but also beyond that, and that's the word trade-offs. If you face a situation like the one we are now facing, and that relates to the watershed with Zeiten, but also to the major transitions, which were referred to as the green, the digital, also demography. If you see what kind of major challenges we're having and how they are linked with each other, as Fabian was saying, there's a major question of trade-offs. Where do you invest your energy, your resources into more because you believe that this is the right thing to do, given the priorities you have set? So the question of trade-offs, I think, is major. And the second point is, if you look into what happened in 2022, that is closely linked to what happened in 2014 and what happened in 2008. So it took 6 years and then another 8 years for us to enter a new phase of an escalation, which always meant that it has stronger effects on us. There is a danger that we will find ourselves in 5, 7, or 8 years in a situation where some of the consequences of what we see happening in front of our eyes since 24th of February, we will only see after that time span has elapsed. And then with respect to the economy, and that's where the link is between geopolitics and geo-economics, obviously China is looking closely at what's happening in Ukraine. And obviously there's a link to Taiwan.
Yeah.
And if there is an escalation of that situation, which seems so far away from us, that will have massive economic effects on us. Are we preparing for that? Now you could ask, can you prepare for it? I think we need to. And that for me is the major lesson of the past 10, 15 years. And I'm not sure we're taking that. And that's where the links between geo-economic and geopolitical are.
Thank you very much. I want to come back to the question of institutional reform, and you referred to part of Paul Taylor's question or comment about forcing people to sit down and thrash things out. And I'm thinking in terms of those trade-offs as well, that honest dialogue that we need to have. But the first part of his question was, isn't institutional reform a rabbit hole that would divert us for years with an uncertain outcome, given the need for referendums to ratify? And John Palmer, you wanted to come in. You wrote a comment, but it would be good to hear it from you. John, I've unmuted you.
Yes, thank you. Listening to this discussion reminds me of the discussions prior to the previous big steps, I'm thinking back over 30, 40 years, that were taken by the EU, and all the issues of what is our collective interest, how is it going to be defined in future, etc., in this new global situation, was in the past begun by taking the debate in some ways to the member states and when I say member states, I mean beyond the government, creating through public hearings, through discussions with a wide range of civil society. Is there a mandate that could be given for such a major inquiry by the institutions to help draw on the positive aspects of public support for the Union as well as the negatives?
I think that was the idea, part of the idea behind the Conference on the Future of Europe, which has now happened and receded. Let me just read out, before I come back to you, and Fabian, I will come to you. Jan van Eersel says on the issue of leadership, leadership is required, but who is entitled, he asks, to who is entitled or accepted to take the initiative to create opportunities for leadership and a strategic assessment? And I'm throwing it in here because he says the problem starts with France and Germany divided on essential issues. There is no appetite for internal reform, and the trigger for unity has always been a crisis. So he's talking, his question there comes about overcoming mistrust against leaderships, but I threw it in because it links to this question of internal reform. You've all talked about the strategic approach we need in some of these fundamental issues, that second step change that Brigid talked about at the beginning. But the questions from our audience much more pointing towards, yeah, but it's not doable. Fabian.
Well, I'm afraid I'm probably in the same line. It's not doable because I think at the moment I cannot see where the impetus is going to come from. I mean, on Paul's question, I think, and this also links to John's question, I think, yes, we should have a process where we discuss what we want to do, where strategically we want to go. Also, maybe a process which goes wider, which looks intergenerationally, not just at the current generation, but looks at what kind of world do we want our children to live in. I can't see it happening, but I think it's something we should do. And then the outcome of something like that should determine how we are reforming the union, how we are changing the instruments. And there I'm very much with Paul. I think we have to be very pragmatic. We have to be able to address the issues as they are. Having a long convention, which is going to be difficult politically, etc., is probably not going to be the right thing at this moment, also because it doesn't produce the answers for the immediate future, where we have to have answers for the challenges we face. So using passerelle clauses, using processes which are in parallel to the European Union processes, using extra budgets, using political coercion mechanism. I mean, all of this is part of what you have to do, but to do that, you first have to agree where you want to go. But I think the one thing which is really worrying, and that really goes to what John was saying, I think what we're seeing at the moment is rather the opposite. I think the European level is losing more and more traction at the national level. And when we're looking at the issues which we're facing, we have to have that integration between the European level and the national level to address them effectively. But especially in some of the bigger countries, when you have debates around energy, around the issues we are facing in foreign policy, etc., Europe doesn't even feature. People don't even think about Europe anymore when it comes to these debates.
Thank you very much. Just to throw in a comment from Guillaume McLaughlin, just in, the crisis aspect, he says, is overdone. The convention, which was successful in its reflection process and product, was not born out of crisis, but rather out of leadership. We keep coming back to that issue. But Brigid, to those who say now is not the time for fundamental reform versus those who say, and I link this to the debate about absorption capacity with enlargement, now is precisely the time, and the time is more urgent than ever before, given the Zeitenwende, the watershed. What do you say?
So I would say, firstly, two things. The Lisbon Treaty is a lot more robust treaty than I think it's been given credit for. It actually, if we think of Nice and Amsterdam, I think Lisbon really strengthened the governance capacity of the EU. So I'm a fan. The second thing is, when we talk about fundamental reform, are we talking about changing institutions, changing decision rules? That's how we usually talk about it. But there's a heroic assumption there that if you change institutions, you change outcomes. So I think we need to be, more circumspect as to when we discuss reform, the possible outcomes. Now, I would strongly at this stage say that we should look at the passerelle clauses and what can be done within the existing institutional primary law, rather than immediately launching a convention that could lead to less and less and end up simply not being able to be ratified by the member states, and with 27 states. So I think we need to think very carefully about what formal reform, and that heroic assumption that if you change the decision rules, you automatically get better outcomes. So I would be more circumspect in that.
Thank you, Janis.
But I do think that as a first step, Lisbon should be exploited for all that it contains. And then if in the longer term, and I don't think we'll have a big enlargement without treaty change. So I think there will be change in the primary law of the EU, but I don't see it in this 5-year cycle. And we have European Parliament elections next year, and I certainly see nothing this side of the
Well, I was going to ask what impact all this discussion might have on those elections. We'll come back to that briefly before we close. But Janis, you were a very keen follower of the Conference on the Future of Europe, indeed part of a project that followed them, the Conference Conversations. You had a Conference on the Future of Europe Observatory. I think you have always been more in the camp of these are fundamental reforms, that we do need to have an honest debate, and we do need to take decisions. Listening to what has been said by our audience and by Fabian and by Brigid, what is your sense of where we are now, and whether this is the wrong moment for it, for the reasons we've talked about, or precisely the right moment, and the loss of momentum is to be lamented?
I have always been in the camp of those who have been arguing that a standstill of the EU, also in terms of its governance institutional structure, is not an option. I think it needs to further develop. Now, if I put on my realist hat, I must unfortunately agree with Fabian in terms of the perspectives of actually moving forward when it comes to reforms. If I put on the hat of someone who's trying to think of things constructively and analytically, I don't see a way how we can avoid it. We need to further reform the European Union. The question is how and when. And there is this appreciation, the general appreciation, that we will have to at some point reform the EU, but we will do so when time will have come to do so. When the pressure is there, we will do that. And I think we've falling into the trap of some illusions here. And that's where I would say we should look at things differently. One, I do not believe that the EU will reform itself in whatever way, by the way, whether you use the elements which are provided through the Lisbon Treaty or you do something more fundamentally, that the EU will be reformed in order to be able to also further enlarge in one go. I think one lesson of the past is that it might take different steps in order to get to the moment where we have actually reformed the EU well enough.
So we need to do some of it now.
We don't need to push it to the end and say, and this now is the moment and we will do everything together. I think this is politically is wrong, and I think it's also short-sighted. Reality tells us that it's different. And the second is, if we have the convention narrative in front of us, we have a certain picture which always we relate to the convention which led to the constitutional treaty. We could also look at the convention in a different way. Let's not always look at it through the prism of what happened in 2002, 2003. There are other ways, even of dealing with the convention. The last point, which relates
very briefly, sorry,
what John said, when it comes to the involvement of citizens, the major potential of that is the pressure function coming from it. The pressure function coming from this element in order to push the system to move ahead when it comes to reform. However, what we've seen is that different coalitions have been there in place to undermine the potential pressure function of involving citizens, so not only member states and their governments in this process.
Fabian, 30 seconds. I know you want to jump in, but I do want to talk about the European elections before we close.
I just wanted to emphasize the what we already talked about, the linkages between different areas. We shouldn't forget that internal reform is also a precondition for enlargement. So we have to make those kind of linkages to be able to make progress on a number of different areas. So they're not separate issues.
Thank you very much. Brigid, you mentioned the European elections. Let's come to those last, and we literally have a couple of minutes each on this one. How do you see all these developments, these debates, this discussion that we're having now impacting on the campaigns, on the outcomes in member states when we come to next year's European Parliament elections, and linking all this to the leadership question that has come up so many times? Do you feel these elections could help to give Europe the leadership it needs to address these challenges, or could make the situation even worse?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that the European Parliament as an institution is going into these elections in a very poor state. It's extraordinary that it took the Belgian police to begin to investigate. Now, obviously, this is a judicial process, so I won't say too much, but this is not good for the European Parliament. And some of the issues about the internal management of the Parliament were well known for a very long time. And the leadership, the political leadership of the Parliament has not tackled this in an appropriate way with the urgency that it requires. So I think there's a danger in the next European Parliament elections that the Parliament itself becomes an issue. And particularly for the radical right, it's an easy one. It's very easy. Those corrupt politicians, that corrupt institution. So I think it is very bad for the Parliament. There was an increase in turnout in the last election. Let's hope it's maintained, that the salience of the war will ensure that that's maintained. Whether or not this helps or hinders depends very much on the outcome. What will the balance be in the Parliament after the election? Who will be capable of having supermajorities, which are required in order for the Parliament to function? But I would say something else about the Parliament, and that is that the Parliament is the quintessential, its power is legislation. But in a world of geopolitics, high politics, then legislation is part of it, but not all of it. So also a lot of the meaty issues are dealt with between the Commission and the Council system and the European Council, and the Parliament is somewhat on the margins.
Thank you very much. Fabian, and then I'll give Janis the last word.
I think firstly, it's really important to emphasize that politics has become much more volatile. And that also means it's very difficult to predict things even a year ahead. If we look at, for example, the German election, who would have thought we would have this kind of government in the run-up to that election? So things might change, but overall, I think the risk is rather that we have a more fragmented parliament, a parliament where it becomes also more difficult to agree on contentious issues. Some of the developments we've already seen that, for example, when it comes to trade deals or those kind of issues, that it becomes much harder to construct majorities, and that the fringes get much stronger, and that they are much more able to interrupt business. So I think this is what we are likely to have. It could be even more disastrous if we have, for example, a very bad winter, depending also on the developments in the war. We shouldn't forget that that will also have a big impact. But I think the overall question really is, are we going to have a parliament which can really function within the context of what we have described? And there, I think Brigid's point about what we're now having much more at the European level, or what we have to have much more, is the exercise of executive powers. And how does the parliament play a constructive role in that? And how do we also make the linkages between the national level and the European level, which continues to be a perennial problem? Thank
you very much. Janis, you have the last word.
Unfortunately, I think if I look into the perspectives for the EP elections, I worry. And it relates to two things we had been discussing. One, and you didn't use the word, Brigid, I'll use it, so-called Qatargate. And second, the marginalization of the EU at the national level. And that for me means that there's a high chance that, contrary to last time in 2019, that the turnout rate will be less than it was last time around. And that means that what Fabian was indicating, that you will probably have a more fragmented European Parliament, that you will have anti-EU forces gaining power because a lot of people will abstain or potentially abstain from going to vote. And the big difference is, and that's why in 2019, and that I didn't expect that in 18, that the turnout rate would move up to the degree it did, is because at the time we were able to convey that EP elections matter, that they are relevant. And I fear, because of this trend of the EU being marginalized in national debates, not being seen as the center stage when it comes to major challenges, that will not convey the message to citizens, to voters, to go and vote. And that might result not only in a potentially even weaker European Parliament, because the 2019-2024 Parliament is already weaker than the 14 to 2019 Parliament, that it would not only lead to a weaker European Parliament, but that it will also have negative effects for the EU in general. So I must say that I'm worried. I'm not saying that this is a done game. There's still some things that can be done, but you need to turn attention to that. And the last point, just a half second, it also relates to the future EU leadership configuration of the EU. And we should not find ourselves again in 2024, where we found ourselves in 2019, because the outcome of 2019 is what we described earlier, which is a leadership issue at the top level of the EU. And we need to think about this earlier. And it's not only about who gains what and who becomes what and which candidate is being supported, which political family will win or lose. It's bigger than that, but that's not the way of thinking. So I'm here probably more of an idealist than a realist.
Thank you very much. And I'm sure this is something we will come back to in the next 50 EPC updates, hoping that there will be that many again. I wish we had double the time. Fascinating discussion. Thank you all very much. Just to flag up a couple of events next week, or activities at the EPC that link to precisely what we've been discussing. On Thursday next week, there is a breakfast policy briefing on transatlantic relations at a time of war and global upheaval. And if you haven't seen it, discussion paper just out on the Trade and Technology Council, published under the auspices of the EPC and Atlantic Councils project, TTC Track 2 Dialogues. Other papers, other events, also take a look at the EPC website. Brigid, thank you so much for being with us today. Always great to get your insights, your thoughts and your analysis. I'm sure we will come back on this issue of Europe, a collective power Europe in the future. Thank you so much. Lovely to have you. Fabian, Janis, as always, thank you all to all of you for joining us, and see you next time.
Very much.
See you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.